like that, which rouses public opinion. Also, in New York in 1932, there was a guy named Vincent Mad Dog Call who worked with Dutch Schultz, and he was a real nut. Not that Schultz was any prize either, but and it's one of those drive-by shootings, you know, like in the movie, like in the James Cagney movies, and they kill like a 5-year-old boy. You know, that's bad PR too. And then Call ends up getting it in a phone booth down in Chelsea. So the violence is escalating. Also, again, tax policy. So politically, Prohibition has been moving along pretty seamlessly, and the idea is you can't repeal this, because 13 states with a population less than New York State, the big state then, could block repeal. So you're either going to have to nullify it, in other words, ignore it, break it flagrantly, which is something like Clarence Darrow says, forget repeal, just break it, okay? And the penalties are fairly small, so just break it. Or modify the Volstead Act, the enabling legislation. That you can do by Congress, but in 1928, there's almost like a national referendum on Prohibition when you've got the extremely wet Al Smith running versus Herbert Hoover, who seems to be dry, and Hoover kills Smith, and you get a very big margin in Congress, more than 2/3 in the House, more than 2/3 in the Senate. I think it's 43 out of 48 governors are dry. Okay, so it's like this is not going to end. This is going along. But one of the things which is going to cause it to, well, Herbert Hoover follows Calvin Coolidge, who spent his whole career minding his own business. Herbert Hoover couldn't. He appoints a commission to look into law enforcement in Prohibition, and this steers the whole hornet's nest stuff. And there's it points to all the problems in Prohibition, but it also says that, we should keep it largely. The majority of people say we should keep it, although a bunch of people say it should be by sale of government entities, like for warehouses or stores. And the newspaper columnist sums up the findings of this commission, which was called the Wickersham Commission, which was also called the Liquor Sham Commission. And Adams said, Prohibition is an awful flop. We like it. It can't stop what it's meant to stop. We like it. It's left a trail of graft and slime. It doesn't prohibit worth a dime. It's filled our land with vice and crime. Nevertheless, we're for it. And that was his summary of the Wickersham report. The other thing which happens is, getting back to taxes, there had been an organization opposed to Prohibition right from when it starts. And there were a bunch of rich guys behind it. There's always rich guys behind everything, okay? That's who you go to for donations. But in 1926, Pierre S. DuPont, who had been a Prohibition, basically says, I'm paying too many taxes. And if you were taxing that booze again, I could pay less taxes. And he gets his friend, he gets his relatives, and he gets his friends, and he gets, I think, something like 13 of the 24 directors of General Motors to be on the board of this organization, and they start ramping up. And they gain an ally around 1930, when the wife of the treasurer of their organization goes public. She had been on the Republican National Committee, but now all very patrician, stately-looking woman, forms an organization of women to oppose Prohibition. And this is important for optics, because go back to the beginning of Prohibition, and it's the women okay? So you make it respectable on the other side. It's not just the, the brewers and the gangsters who want it. It's respectable high society women. So it almost has a social cachet now to be for repeal. Speaking of social cachet, so did Prohibition work? In some ways, yes. In some ways, it did reduce drinking. There were, they say, milk consumption went up, Coca-Cola consumption went up, savings went up, workplace accidents went down, cirrhosis went down. Andrew Sinclair, who was a critic of Prohibition, thinks that at the end of Prohibition, it was down by like a third. Prohibitionists say it might have been down by 80%, maybe somewhere in the middle. But what happened was, and this is something which Sinclair had to say, who was opposed to Prohibition. He said, the working men of America drank half their usual amount of liquor and saved $1 billion a year. The middle classes drank the same amount of liquor and lost $1 billion a year because they were paying more. Because, being illegal, the prices were up. So if you didn't have the money, you didn't spend it as much. But if you did have the money and it became, all those movies, all the newsreels you see, I was tempted to show up in a tuxedo today just to look like I came from a speakeasy or something, or all the women dancing on tables and all that. So in 1920, taxes, violence, corruption, bribery, and the big thing, Prohibition. Or not Prohibition, the Depression. 1929, and the government doesn't have the money to help people out. Now, the question is also, should the government spend money to help people out? But they really don't have it. And it's like, and the anti-prohibition people are saying, well, you can get the money from this, and you can also put people to work, brewing beer or wine or spirits or bartending or making beer taps or seriously. And this is the argument. Now, they say Prohibition hasn't worked. They also, on the other hand, say, if you bring back alcohol, you can put 700,000 to 1 million people working, okay? Which is like, I hope not. So the arguments become very powerful then. Hoover wobbles on Prohibition. The Republicans say they're going to send it back to the states. And by 1932, Franklin Roosevelt had always been sort of wobbly on the issue, not like Al Smith. By then, he's all for repeal. He's elected, and as soon as he takes office, the Congress does modify the Volstead Act, allowing beer and wine. That was in their power. And it is sent, the amendment to repeal is sent to the states in February. And remember what I said about the two amendments were done in unique ways. So the wets, the people for repeal, were very wary of what the people in the state legislatures would be. They weren't sure they could get the votes in the state legislatures. So this is the only amendment which says it's going to be by state conventions. And they have special elections to elect these conventions. And in these votes, 72% of the people vote for repeal. And it's not repealed in 7 years. It's repealed like almost 10 months, from February to November. And so that's the story of Prohibition. That's the story of repeal. That's the story of some of which happened in between, because there was a hell of a lot which happened. And thank you all very much for coming. And if you have questions, let me know.
Did you mention the date of the repeal?
The date of the repeal was either November or December of 1933. Yeah.
Yeah, until recently, there were drive towns in New York State.
Yeah, I've seen it on the internet that there still are some,
Yeah.
maybe a handful, and some of them are like in the southern tier, which is interesting because when they increased the penalties in 1929 for Prohibition violation, the sponsor in the House was from the southern tier. Yeah. Hey, you had your hand up in the back, sir? No? No? You're just, okay. Okay, you were taking notes. What's that?
Did you grow up in Amsterdam?
I did grow up in
You
Amsterdam.
may not be aware of the O'Connell machine at Albany and the Hedrick Brewery
Oh,
and
Hedrick.
and the fact that those liquor stores, those bars that did not sell Hedrick beer
Yes.
were either shut down or had to close early.
Well,
And I grew up with one O'Connell across the street
Yeah.
that ran the brewery, that owned the brewery. I ran errands for him. And next to me was a judge, a city court judge, who knows, he may have said, if any of you have any problem with your people, send a picture on the judge and I'll take care of it.
yeah. Well, I remember the stories that the Hedrick beer was so horrible that you had to buy it if you were a saloon keeper.
Right.
But your customers didn't have to buy it. And so the saloon keepers would end up dumping this stuff into the sewers. And all the fish in the Hudson were drunk or deformed or something like that. But, it probably was the 1970s. And I was writing for a newspaper in this area called Kite. It was sort of like Metroland. It was an arts weekly. And I went and interviewed Kurt Vonnegut's brother, who was a very noted meteorologist at the University of Albany. And I was in his living room, and he says, "Would you like a beer?" And I said, "Oh, okay." And he comes out with a can of warm Hedricks. I can assure you, it lived up to its reputation. Yes, sir.
I guess I always had an impression that during Prohibition, the booze came over the border from Canada, but I'm thinking maybe that's not the case.
Oh, it came from just about everywhere. Although considering all the talk we have of the Mexican border now, I never see much about stuff coming directly up from Mexico. It probably came up the coastline to San Francisco, seriously. And people would hire taxi cabs, either from New York City or Albany or anywhere, and go up to Montreal and fill it with cases of booze, or would just kind of walk through the border in Vermont. So you would come up that way. The Great Plains, that's where Bronfman really started pouring the booze across the border. But where it really leaked the biggest was Detroit. I mean, think of Detroit is where you've got this big city right on the border, and it's separated by this little lake, and they would have running gun battles between Prohibition agents and the bootleggers coming in from Windsor, Ontario. The government of Ontario built a special warehouse to keep all the booze in, which was supposedly going to hotels. And for a while they had a charade where it was going to the hotels in Windsor, a big resort area, of course. And then they stopped that and they said, okay, just send it in. You would also have to do, the bootleggers, Canada would tax the booze coming like that out of Canada into America, okay? But what you could do to get around that, there's always some way to get around it in Prohibition, is France has two islands off the coast of Canada to this day, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, or however it's pronounced. And so a lot of Canadian booze either came in from Europe or booze from Europe or Canada, and it would be shipped out by the bootleggers there. And of course, the entire East Coast, there was a guy, the expression, there's controversy. The expression, the real McCoy, that may or may not have come from a bootlegger named Bill McCoy. And if you got his booze instead of like this rock guy, it would kill you. And some of the booze would make you blind. Okay. So McCoy, there would be a rum runner's row, like off the coast of New Jersey or Long Island. In Long Island, they would land and then they would have to put the stuff on trucks and bring it into the city. What could happen then? It wasn't so much the cops, it was the other bootleggers, it was the other gangsters. You had to worry about hijackers. So one of the guys who you would hire to protect your booze was Legs Diamond, who of course was later murdered, down the road in Albany on Dove Street. So there were all these ways to get booze into the country. And some of the brands were in England of the hard stuff, or Scotland, were specifically marketed for the American market. Yeah. And Joe Kennedy later became big in that. You had a question.
Yeah, well, a comment really. During the Depression, my father, this was before he met and married my mother, he used to travel all over the country, and he was in Chicago, and you were talking about the mob violence, and it was horrible in Chicago, and when he was in Chicago and he came back to the rooming house he was staying in one night, and as he was coming up the steps to the house there, the fellow came out of the and downstairs, and they passed one another. My dad said, "Oh, hello," guy said, "No." And as soon as my father got in, he got halfway up the stairs, he hears all of this machine gun fire. And I guess this guy, it was the mob warfare that was going on.
Well, they would do it. One thing I left out, I forgot, was in 1928, maybe 27, 28, April, there was a primary in the Republican Party. And it was called the Pineapple Primary. And why? Because one of the slang terms for hand grenades was a pineapple. The bombings were fairly big back then by gangsters. And even before Prohibition, you would see that as an extortion kind of thing, where you pay protection, if you know what's good for you. And so I think there were like 50 bombings during the primary. It was between the faction run by Big Bill Thompson, the guy who was the protector of Al Capone, and the United States Senator, a fellow named Deneen. And Deneen's home was actually bombed during the primary. That's how rough they played. So, anyone else?
None?
Yes.
Well, I was a little concerned about the statistics about how Prohibition seems to have improved the health of so many Americans when, as you mentioned just now, so much blindness occurred from this, this cheap booze or homemade stuff, that had nobody watching over the,
Right.
the mix, bathtub gin and so forth. It's hard to believe, except for the fact that the poor couldn't afford it.
Right.
That makes a difference. It's hard to believe that really the health of the nation improved under the Prohibition, because there was so much. My in-laws, for instance, who were real teetotalers when I knew them, the only time they ever drank in their lives was when it was illegal. And I thought it wasn't illegal to drink. It was illegal to sell it, I guess,
Well,
So
to sell,
they probably
manufacture,
said
or
to them-
transport.
Yeah, but they probably told themselves it's not illegal to drink.
Well, it may not have been, depending on how they got it. Well, there was a case it went to court. A United States, a banker from New York City contracted with a bootlegger in Philadelphia for a shipment of hooch. And it gets intercepted, and both are arrested and indicted. And the trial court convicts the banker of transporting, conspiracy to transport. Okay, he's not manufacturing, he's not selling, but he's obviously part of this because he hired it. Okay, and then the federal appeals court said no, because the law specifically had exempted drinking. So that guy went free. It was, there were all these loopholes. But I think that the question of the poisoning of the liquor, which could be, really uncontrolled, unregulated. Think of, if we didn't have health laws on something. Now, there's a story which goes around that the federal government put stuff in booze to kill people during the Prohibition.
Oh.
And 10,000 people died. One of these internet fact-checking things called Snopes looked into that and said, yeah, they were putting stuff in. But this was something which predated Prohibition and started in Europe, which was to have industrial alcohol so it wouldn't be taxed, actually. Again, taxation policies. So, and then in the mid part of the decade of the 20s, they were putting more powerful stuff in. And the figure of 10,000 comes from a fairly recent author's book, and they can't figure out where it came from, which probably means it wasn't true. Which is not to say people weren't dying, because a few months ago, I was looking up my own family history. And there was a situation in 1935 in that bar where I had grown up later, okay? And there's a question of whether liquor was being distributed in the legal way. Because, you have to go through a distributor since Prohibition. A guy at a bar can't just go into the liquor store and buy a bottle. It's got to go through the distributor. So one of my relatives was on trial, okay? And all the guys in the bar say they were all offered booze, okay, by these sting operators from the Liquor Dealers Association, and they all refused it. Which is like strained credulity, but it worked. And one of the guys who says he was not going to take the free booze as the sting said, no, I think to the east, to the west, I think of all the poison. What he was referring to was in that early part of 1935, there were guys in Utica making booze after Prohibition. Okay? And 31 people died. 4 women. They died in Utica and they died in Gloversville. Yeah, you don't think of that, but I saw a stat where the same amount of revenuers, were being shot after Prohibition as during Prohibition. Yeah, you think of those, the hills and the hollers down south, and they got the squirrel gun out in like 1946 or something. So yeah, a lot of when you're tracking, cause and effect, and certainly when you're tracking things which are illegal. You pays your money and takes your choice with the stats. So I report, you decide.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else? Okay, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.